We're going to be in 1 Samuel 18, and we will continue with Ty's lesson he began this quarter with turning points and the study through the life of David. And last week, Ty started looking at the third turning point that was in David's life. He talked about something that we all have studied since we were little, which is the battle with Goliath. And Ty, talked about, giants we will probably face today. And I think he even had a little comment about me. I wasn't in here last week. I was in the teen class, but that most likely we won't face a physical giant like Goliath, but there were some spiritual ones. And, probably the closest thing to a physical giant I'd ever come across is when I was at UNA, we had an exhibition game with a semi-pro team, and one of the guys on that team was 7'6", and at one point I had to guard this guy. So that, fairly large human being, that's probably about the largest guy I've stood next to. I think I came about to his shoulder. So pretty big guy. But so that's about physically probably the largest person I've ever been around. But at the end of Ty's lesson, he's talked about spiritual giants and how we could apply it to us today. And I think maybe, as we hopefully see as we go through chapter 18, is that these spiritual giants can sometimes be more of a daunting task than the physical one that David had with Goliath. I think in some ways maybe David trained for the physical fight with Goliath. Ty talked about in chapter 17 with whether it was a bear, a lion, whatever it was, the training with his slingshot, that maybe oftentimes we're not fully training for the spiritual battle. And I think Ty as well talked about and what I actually somewhat think is Goliath was the actual underdog in the battle. If you kind of read it closely in David's mindset, I think David knew the victory was won before the battle started. So the spiritual battles that pose a threat, as we kind of get into what chapter 18 is going to be about. Last week, the two things Ty mentioned was spiritual battles pose a threat to your spiritual well-being. So anything that is in your way spiritually, we oftentimes are going to see as a giant, whether it's something at work, someone you have an issue with, it could be a family member, just anything that gets in our way. Ephesians 6:10 and 11 says, "Finally be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." 1 Peter 5:8-9 says, "Be alert and sober-minded. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking for someone to devour. Resist him, stand firm in your faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings." And then one of the last things he mentioned was, and I really like this in the way he put it last week, he said, if you're going in God's direction, every giant that is in your path is also in God's path. And I thought that was a really good comment, and Ty went through chapter 17 and specifically outlined the 3 times where David said, "You are in defiance of my God." And so I think that sets us up to chapter 18. And so the turning point from chapter 18 comes from verse 9. And it says, "So saw I David from that day forward." And so the word there, once the Bible was translated into Greek, the word they used was envidio, which means to envy. And so you could read the verse and say that Saul envied David from that point forward. So I'd like for us to look at the text tonight, starting with verse 1, kind of break it apart in a couple different sections, and then talk about how that could apply to us. So the text, I feel like, is kind of broken into two sections. One, it starts with David's rise in the chapter 18. We know that he's had a pretty good experience with chapter 17 with fame, as we see here as we start reading. And he's got a lot of good things going for him. So he's had a lot of success. A lot of people are telling him he's done a great job. And so, and then we have Saul and his rage on the second part of the chapter. So starting in verse 1, it says, "Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him. He gave it to David and his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt." So we see with those first 4 verses that the true love that Jonathan and David had, and the whole idea that they were bound together. Each soul was bound, and it was more like Jonathan's was bound to David. So Jonathan wanted to make sure that David's needs was even above his own. And there's also, I feel like, an indication that something else did the binding. And either that was the power of God there, as far as, that type of love that you would have and that we would have for each other. We're brothers and sisters in Christ, or that common experiences they've gone through. Both have had several, as their lives is intertwined, as Jonathan, who's supposed to be the heir to the throne, and David, who has been promised the throne one day. So, going into verse 5, we see, "So David went, and wherever Saul sent him, and he behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of the war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced, and they said," Now, I think everything in Saul's mind is going great here. Like, he sees that he is going to be praised. But the end of verse 7, when it says, "Saul has slain his thousands," and you can just, probably sense just the air go out of Saul when he hears the next line, which gives David credit for 10,000s. So, in the study of 1 Samuel, we can see that Saul had done some great and mighty things as long as he was in God's will. As long as he was doing what God wanted him to do, and he was doing God's will, everything was going great, winning wars with the Philistines. But once he started being disobedient to God, his life started falling apart. And I think that's something Saul does not remember as we go through chapter 18. So with verse 8, Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me only 1,000. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" So again, here, David's done nothing wrong. He's just simply done what Saul asked him to do. He's tried to, honor God. He just killed Goliath. Everybody's happy. Everybody's excited. But Saul becomes jealous and envious. So in verse 9, this is where we have our turning point, not only for David, but also for Saul, because of what this ends up doing to Saul. So Saul eyed David, or envied David, from that day forward. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. So as we see starting with, verse 5 on, that Saul's jealousy, which turned into anger, and then towards the end of the chapter, we're turned into a fear of David. Something that I've talked about with my basketball players and then also students in my classroom is a saying that we often use called standards over feelings. And there's going to be times in life where your feelings, you're not going to really want to do what's right. You're not going to want to maybe do the right thing, or as far as basketball and working out goes, you may not feel like it, you're tired. But there's always a standard that you should rely on. And I feel like David has his standard in the right place, as Ty had discussed last week with all through chapter 17, giving all credit to God and saying that God's will be done. And I think with David relying on that standard and his faith in the Lord, that, we don't see a lot in chapter 18 of David's feelings, but we see that as we go in the chapters, Saul, his feelings, his jealousy, his rage is going to keep consuming him. Like I'd mentioned a few minutes ago, David at this point, we don't see anything he has done wrong. Like David did not write this song that the women were singing. That's just how they felt. They were giving David praise, but David was not doing anything. He wasn't, even though he knew he was anointed and he was going to be king, he wasn't doing anything that God didn't want him to do. He wasn't rubbing that in his face. He wasn't doing anything to where he deserved that from Saul. It was all stemming from Saul's heart and the insecurity he had. That it wasn't good enough for Saul that he had slain thousands. And if we go back all the way to the beginning of the book, we can see all the great things Saul had done. But that wasn't enough. He at this point knows that the kingdom is going to leave his family. And that's something that he should have been able to understand. Like the kingship that Saul had, that was a gift from God. We see a lot of the great things that Saul did right before it talks about the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul. So when Saul was doing his great things, when he was killing thousands, when he was doing all these things, the Spirit of the Lord was with him. And that's when the Spirit of the Lord left him, is when he was having his issues. Someone like David couldn't take the throne anyway unless God gave it to him. So that was the whole thing, is his position and everything he had was a gift from God. And he should understand that God's will would be done with it. And as long as God wanted David to be in power one day, that was going to happen. So Saul's responsibility was to stay in favor with God, honor God, and we know that with the mistakes he was making, that connection, that being in the will of God was not there. I do want to look in John 15 real quick before we get back to the text. John 15, verse 1 through 8, where Jesus says that he is the true vine. Jesus is about to be delivered up to be crucified. It's one of the last things in John that he talks with his disciples about. And verses 4 and 5, he says, "Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing." Here, and I don't know, maybe the disciples would rather have it, but he didn't give them some 5-year plan or strategies for success or, if y'all will do all this, then people will come to know me and all that. His focus in some of the last time on earth was to remind the disciples to be connected to Jesus and that stay in his will. And just like the end of verse 5 says, without me, you can do nothing. And I think that's what Saul is losing sight of, is that without God controlling events and guiding him and putting him in the right path, God's will is not being done. Saul probably sees David as his giant again, just like we had the physical giant of Goliath. But since Saul was not in God's will, David wasn't in God's way, just like Ty talked about last week. David had his path that he was trying to lead and do great things for God and always give God the credit and always know that when the battle was over, the only way he could have got through it was with God. Same way with the physical giant of Goliath. No one was going to look at Goliath, who was 9'9", and David, he probably wasn't 6 feet, and say David won that without God. As we look into back in 1 Samuel 18, and we see in verse 9, verse 8, Saul starts becoming very angry. We see in 9 the envy, and then we see that buildup because, and we would see this throughout the book, but it probably wasn't in the best interest to be around Saul when spears were nearby. As it says, Saul's sitting there and David's playing for him and there's a spear nearby. And so he just grabs it and chunks it at him. It says in verse 11, "And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall." So it wasn't, I don't know how you could nicely throw a spear at someone, but the intent with the throw was he actually wanted to pin David to a wall. So, we think about, the anger behind that. And maybe some of the things, we would say to someone, not like if we were going to, trying to physically kill them, but with our words, when we're angry, we have things that, we make people understand that we're angry at you. So Saul put that into action. We see that his emotions first started in his heart, and they just kept building and kept building. We saw in Ty's lessons that the playing for King Saul actually soothed him, made him feel better. Maybe the evil spirit would leave. But now we see that wasn't even helping, and the anger against David just kept growing and growing until there was that physical action of trying to hurt David. And again, we see, there's about three points in the chapter uh, where Saul wants David dead. But again, there was nothing justified. David has done nothing wrong to this point. He's probably knows Saul can't stand him, but David's just going about his business. He's doing what his job is. He's playing the harp. He's supposed to go lead the military and then come back. He does that. Like, he's just doing everything he's told. And David never really intended for anything other than God's will to be done. And here's Saul, wanting him physically dead, but also, like we said earlier, just the envy and the jealousy for David. So the murder attempts start in verse 11. And then in verse 12, it says, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And therefore when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. So we still have, Saul sees that David keeps doing the right thing no matter what Saul does. And I know that could probably be even more frustrating. Like, probably Saul wanted David to be afraid. He wanted him to get mad or maybe try to do something back to him. But Saul, it's almost like it just made him more upset, and then that fear sets in because he knows, I think deep down, where God's will and where God's authority for what's going to happen is going to come from. That it is God's will. God has said the kingdom will leave him and his household. And I think it was just him not wanting to accept that. Saul was trying to do everything he could to prevent that. And I think his idea was, well, if I kill David, then God's will can't happen. Again there, I don't know, David was able to escape the spear. And if we look in a few more verses, we're going to see everything, starting in verse 17, everything Saul is doing is a scheme or a plot or something that can get rid of David. So Saul then starts having the idea, well, I'll just have him marry my daughter. So in verse 17, it says, here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So Saul's thinking, if I can't kill him, then somehow the Philistines will kill him, and I'll be rid of David that way. But in verse 18, David said to Saul, who am I? What is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be son-in-law to the king? But it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Maholathite, as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. So, again, we see Saul, one of his plans backfiring. Like, he wanted the oldest daughter to marry him, who probably didn't have any feelings for David. But again, with David working in God's will, the daughter who was actually in love with David, he would end up marrying. And that way, Again, Saul's plans were meant for evil. They wanted to destroy David, but everything keeps working out for David. So verse 22 says, Saul commanded his servants, communicate with David secretly and say, look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servant spoke these words in the hearing of David. And David said, does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am poor and lightly esteemed? And the servants of David told him, in this manner David spoke. Then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them a full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. So we see again, hoping, I know David doesn't have any money. He can't pay the dowry in order to be worthy of the king's son-in-law. So he's hoping that by having to kill the Philistines, that one of them will kill him. And again, that plan does not work out. Saul's anger, on in chapter 20, we see the account where, Saul actually tries to kill his own son, Jonathan. Once this rage starts dwelling within Saul, it's like there was just no stopping it, that he was willing to do whatever it took. So it's like he spent his day scheming. How could he defeat David? What could he do to, I guess you'd say win? Like, how could he win this battle but he doesn't even have God on his side? If you look back at chapter 17 that Ty talked about last week, verse 45, and it's the same thing David said to the Philistine as they were about to do physical battle. Verse 45 says, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, but the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. And we don't really have that kind of account from David in verse 18. But I know just from reading within the scriptures, I know that had to be David's mindset. Like the same mindset that he used to fight the physical giant, I think he had to use on a daily basis with Saul. And at least with the physical giant, and David knew he was going to win, I don't know how long this actually lasts, probably, I guess, just a couple of minutes from the moment that it says in 48 when he ran towards the army. It's over in minutes, I'm guessing. From the time he grabbed the 5 stones to he flung one at Goliath, like I almost feel like maybe that was the easier battle. And I know we put the greatest influence on chapter 17, but this was something David had to deal with, all of chapter 18, just over and over and over, of, someone constantly attacking him, everything that was happening, even like his wedding day. Saul was scheming behind the scenes to try to get David killed, and that's supposed to be a great thing for David. So David's marriage was still intended to be evil by Saul, who just wanted it to happen so he might could kill him. So as we kind of bring the lesson to a close and think about, what could this chapter teach us about, a turning point in Saul and David's life that we can use to help us. I think, depending on what side that we want to look at this from, we could apply a lesson to us. So we have on the one hand Saul, who was just eaten up with envy, jealousy, anger. That ruined him. I think if you go back to him ruling as a king using his feelings over the standard, like when he was impatient and he didn't want to wait on Samuel. He wasn't going to wait on Samuel just a few more minutes to offer the burnt sacrifice. He wanted to do it because he was worried of what people would think. And again, Saul let his feelings rule how he acted every single day. The flip side of that is, how did David act in response? We see, I think, the response in chapter 17 facing Goliath, that's how David lived his life in chapter 18. That he knew that God was going to win and that Saul was this new giant. And as long as David stayed in the same path that God wanted him to, God would take care of Saul. And, everybody that mattered in his life, as far as in Saul, like his son, his daughter, they all even took to David. That everything was working out in David's favor because David kept doing exactly what he needed to each and every day. So Saul's consumption of his feelings and his jealousy and rage versus how as Christians we are supposed to walk the way Jesus would want us to. Like John 15 says, if we stay connected to Jesus, that's going to give what we need. And obviously, there's a lot of different scripture that would back that up. But I think with Jesus, his main point, the emphasis was that connection. We have the connection to Jesus. And like David did, David had physical connections like we do within the church, as we have brothers and sisters in Christ. He had those like Jonathan and then his wife, as we look through 1 Samuel, that would help him get through that struggle. I think Ty said it pretty good last week too, when he brought up, when did David win the battle? That he had read or studied a lesson where they talked about at what point was the battle won. And he mentioned that in verse 40 of chapter 17, it's when David took his first step. So verse 40, chapter 17, it says, "Then he took his staff in his hand. He chose for him 5 smooth stones from the brook. He put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch, which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine." In some of your Bibles probably say approached. And the moment that David started approaching the Philistine, he'd already probably made up his mind that he was winning. And, there was no guarantee, like verse 41 doesn't say, and God promised David that he would win and all that would happen. Like there was no guarantee. But David knew that God's will would come through if he stayed in that will. So there's one more example in 1 Samuel that I want to talk about in the last few minutes that we have, is when it comes to we have to take that first step because God is going to get us through it, but He's not going to make us, He's not going to push us, He's not going to make us take that step. But we have to have that faith in Christ that we take the first step and then Christ can take over. So I think Samuel probably understands a lot about faith and what it takes to make that first step as we see the story of Hannah. Just to kind of summarize, we know with, Hannah could not have kids, and we have the long enduring of, her husband's other wife. She could have kids. She couldn't, so of course, she was made fun of all the time, like, you can't have kids. And so she went through a lot every time they went to worship. It talks about in the chapter how Hannah could never eat. She was always upset. But if we look in verse 17 of chapter 1. So Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition from which you asked for him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So after Hannah basically made the vow to God, we see that in the start of verse 11. She vows to God what she's willing to do. But at the end of verse 18, it says she's no longer sad. She's eating. She goes on to worship, goes back home. She lives her life as if the promise was already made. Now, again, verse 19 is not God made her a promise at that point. It doesn't say, at the end of verse 18, she became pregnant, or God promised she'd become pregnant. But she knew when she got up from making that vow that it would work out. That if she would turn it all over to God, that it would all work out for good. So very similar to what David did when he had to take that first step to defeat Goliath. And also we see with Hannah, that's all I think we're asked to do, is to try to be on the path that we're supposed to be on, and then God will take care of the rest as long as we're willing to take that first step. And I think that was Abel, so that's all I've got. Any comments or anything as I think we may have a couple minutes. But. All right.